Hi there, and welcome to this presentation on the Revolution in Russia, the rise of the Soviet Union. Notes 12.3a. This is Mr. Marks. Here are some of the terms which you are going to need to know for this section of notes. These notes will come in three parts. Please make sure that you take the moment to pause and write these down. In order to understand the Russian Revolution, you have to understand that Russia had largely remained unchanged for a period of about 300 years. In fact, in 1913, the Romanov dynasty had celebrated its 300th anniversary. There were still serfs working out in the fields. It was still based on a very feudal sort of society. And Nicholas II, he would end up being the last Tsar of Russia, and his wife Alexandra, they weren't much for changing the way things were. Them and their nobility lived in fancy palaces, beautiful buildings, gorgeous churches were where they attended their Sunday service. They were used to the finer things in life, and very much like Louis the XVI and Marie Antoinette, they were oblivious in many ways to what was going on around them. They saw themselves as being good leaders, as being champions for their people, and the truth is they were very much not that. They're celebrating this anniversary, 1913, little knowing that 4 years later, economic and political forces are going to topple this dynasty. The Tsar, not Nicholas II, and by the way, Tsar is much like Kaiser in Germany. It's the Russian word for Caesar, so kind of that whole idea of being an emperor of time. The Tsar at the time, Nicholas II, was weak, and honestly, World War I was not going well for him at this time. In order to show his support for the war, he actually went to the front lines himself, only to discover he really sucked as a military leader. Anyway, he left full control of the country in the hands of his wife Alexandra, and she's going to make a ton of bad decisions, things which are going to make the peasants, the serfs, the working class people even that much more frustrated, and to the point of violent anger against her and her husband. She was German-born, and she knew very little about government, and she'll put her trust in mystical, magical, and ultimately unreliable sources, such as Gregory Rasputin. Just a point before we move off to Rasputin, their real downfall is in their lack to innovate. They resisted giving reforms like most of the rest of Europe was doing, and this is what the people were clamoring for. Worse, they were an autocratic government, which meant that they wanted to have total control of everything. Ironically, the Russian people are going to be giving up one autocratic government into a different totalitarian regime. Anyway, as I said, Alexandra was very much obsessed with the mystical and the magical, and a man who's going to catch her eye is Gregory Rasputin. Now, I gave him a black background because, honestly, he's not a good guy. Okay? He was an illiterate peasant. He was a self-proclaimed holy man, and it was only because he had these miracles that were sort of following him. He had managed to bring up this reputation of being a miracle worker, and either through coincidence or maybe through some understanding of healing that we just don't understand, he was able to heal the Tsarina's, Alexandra's, sick son. And in response, she's going to trust him in everything, which is way more power than this guy can handle. Um, with the Tsar as kind of a front man, and especially once the Tsar goes to the front lines, Rasputin is going to take the opportunity to take full control of the Russian government. He starts dismissing government officials at will. He starts adding in people who ingratiate themselves to him. And he's known to not really be, well, how can I say this? The most moral of people. He is known for his sexual debauchery, large orgies which he would have thrown in his honor, that in some cases even included the Tsarina Alexandra, according to the rumors that were spread around. Now, Rasputin is going to become kind of a focal point, not just for the people that will eventually end up overthrowing the government, but even from other nobles. And he's going to have an interesting end that really does make it so people wonder what powers this man actually had. You see, he'll be invited to a dinner, and at that dinner, they will attempt to poison him. In fact, they'll supposedly put enough poison in his food to kill several men. Um, he doesn't die. And getting really concerned about the fact he's not dying, they go in and they shoot him. While he's there, lying on the floor bleeding, they go over to kind of make sure that he's dead. And the moment that they nudge him, he opens his eyes and screams. He then jumps up and runs out. They continue shooting at him. He runs out and runs through the yard ahead of everybody else, ahead of bullets whizzing around him, and dives into the river. They continue to shoot him. Later on, his body will be found. It looks like he was trying to get out of the river at one point, but had gotten caught up somewhere. And the final, the final cause of death, after being poisoned, shot, beaten, and shot again, drowning. The people most upset with Gregory Rasputin, with the Romanovs, are the proletariat. This is basically just a fancy word for saying the working class. This is made up of factory and railroad workers, miners, and urban wage earners. This is the group of people that the revolutionaries, the people who are going to try to overthrow the government, need to win to their side. As this is the group that's going to be hit hardest by widespread hunger and poverty that was going on through Russia at the time. You'll notice this is the same group of people that the French revolutionaries turned to. Originally, by the way, proletariat meant people who had no wealth other than their son, that their only wealth were the sons that they were able to count on to take care of them in their old age. The proletariat were hit really hard towards the end of 1916 and the beginning of 1917. There were disasters on the battlefield. Remember, Russia is part of World War I at this time. And because of rationing and just due to poor crops and all sorts of just bad luck all around, there were shortages of fuel and food that winter. This created an overall distrust on the Romanov dynasty, and that was only fueled even more when Alexandra and Rasputin start making the really awful decisions that they start making. Marchers started going through the streets in March 1917, and I have an asterisk next to the March up there because while this happened in March according to our calendars, Russia was still on an older calendar that hadn't taken certain certain things into account. So they were about a month off. That made it so the revolution occurred for them in February. So in Russia, it's often referred to as the February Revolution of 1917. In fact, Russia won't adopt the Western calendar for another year after this. So a few of the other dates here, or the months, kind of get confusing depending on if you're talking to people outside of Russia or people inside of Russia. Anyway, marchers, due to this terrible winter, start marching through the streets crying, "Bread, bread." I'm guessing that sounds familiar. Remember how the French Revolution started? Very similar sorts of problems. Hungry people out in the streets, they start causing revolts. You have enough people that are willing to organize them together to overthrow a government. Well, the Tsarina sends troops in order to stop the marching, but these troops were not willing to fire on these people. Maybe because they were family members, maybe because they too were recognizing that the Romanovs had just left touch with everything. And instead, they ended up joining them in many cases. In response to this, the Tsar returns from the front and tries to appease the people, and his advisors tell him it's too late. It's just been messed up too badly. So in order to save his life, his advisors recommend that he abdicate the throne, he give it up. And in its place, which he agrees to do this, he recognizes that things have gone really bad in Russia. In place of this, he puts the Duma, which is the Russian legislative branch, like our Congress. All right, it was called the Duma. He put their Duma in charge, and they immediately started working on drafting a constitution. Again, very much like the French Revolution. But the war kept going on, and troops and food and those sorts of things were still needed over there, and the shortage didn't stop. So these moves to move towards kind of a constitutional democracy like the United States aren't going to go that far because of some pretty powerful forces we're going to talk about in the next part of this presentation. So quickly to review for this, how did the reign of Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra help pave the way for the revolution in Russia? What role did Rasputin play in causing Russia's revolutions? And what were the causes of the March 1917 revolution in Russia?